Beautiful. You're super great at this focusing thing. There we go. That's better. Yeah, I am definitely sorry about last night. I got back, I was doing some things, ate something. I sat down and worked on a few things and got to thinking like, okay, so I need to do a few things until it's time for me to go on online, because I think at that point it was 8 o'clock at night, and I was laying down with my laptop on my stomach, thinking about certain things, and I just zonked out, and it was like 3 a.m. when I woke up. So my bad on not plan to skip last night. It literally happened without me noticing it. I just conked out. But in the meantime, I got some things done today and was tinkering around with some stuff for tonight. The topics of tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about the structure of, in my world building, how I manage divinity right now. Like, all of this is subject to change. So when writing out the world building that I need to do for this, I might have set this to private. We'll find out in a minute. In working on the structure of, let me try something here. And working out the structure of my universe and setting, inherent in the concept of what I'm building, I need to come up with a system of how divinities come into being. Because if I want to build a world in which the characters start out as divinities, fall from divinity, and then try to find a way to get back to divinity, then I'm gonna need to do something about defining what makes divinity happen in a being. I don't know if that makes any sense. Like, I have to build backstory about how the divine comes into being. And in my setting, the general premise is using a universe that has irregular time. So Van Winkle style, or the biblical ages of 200-year-old Methuselah, or whatever it was. If I'm going to build a universe where that happens, I need to have a sense of chaos with time. And so just leaning into that a little bit, I sort of built it around the idea of, at the beginning of time, the beings of chaos rebelled against something that didn't exist yet. So it's sort of like building a rebellion against a thing that hasn't happened yet because you were oppressed by it when it hasn't happened yet. It's like, it's so very confusing to try to frame that way, but it's sort of like taking cause and effect out of sequence. If you've ever watched the Terminator movie, you have the idea of the hero of the reborn because the rebellion sent the father back in time. Spoilers or whatever. So like, if the rebellion didn't exist because of the leader of the rebellion, then they couldn't have sent back the father who couldn't father the leader of the rebellion in the past. And so it has to have happened. And by this same token, I'm sort of building this idea of the seething mass of chaos that was the universe before its beginning. the unending mess of non-existence, not even chaos, but non-existence, is there and not there all at the same time. And the birthing of the universe is to spray out into that nothingness existence, a massive, chaotic, uncontrolled existence. And so, in a certain sense, the chaos that results is not necessarily a good one. It's not a bad one either, necessarily. So the dawn of the universe isn't necessarily like a positive thing. It's also not necessarily a negative thing. I think that might do it. I did have it set to private. I think I set it to public now. We'll see if this is working. I'm very curious to see if that's the case. I didn't know if I could turn public versus private settings on a different computer than the one I'm recording it on. On a light, I guess I can do that. It looks like it's doing that. All right, so the structure of the dawn of the universe is sort of important because I need it to be non-existent and then exist at a certain point, but then exist as if it has always been. And to always be and not be before always being feels like a contradiction. But when you deal with the idea that time can be infinite after a time of not existing, you have the ability to fudge with time streams like that. So that very dawn of chaos birthed into nothingness is the first thing. And I feel like chaos in that structure needs to be like Cthulhu and the elder gods and those types of things. The absolutely chaotic beings. And in my mind, and maybe I don't know enough about the Cthulhu mythos to do it well, in my mind, those are hugely powerful, sort of mind-bendingly complicated in a way that we can't control and doesn't have to make consistent sense beings. But even worse than that, they don't even notice us. We're not important enough for them to notice any more than you particularly wake up on a given day and notice the bacteria around you. For the most part, you're completely unaware of the massive amount of power differential between you and a bacteria. But through our management of our clean environment or things like that, we have an effect over those bacteria, and so do the elder gods over the structure of the universe. But it's not like an intentional, necessarily like no human beings thinking, I'm going to kill that bacteria in particular. And I feel like the other aspect I want the elder gods in my setting to have is to not have logical, consistent, systematic, orderly thought processes. I feel like the more fitting thing for those beings to have would be to be almost just pure, not even necessarily emotion, but just this sort of like, I mean, certain animals definitely think about what they're doing on a regular basis, but I there's that feeling of like, does a caterpillar know what it's doing, or does it just do? And I feel like that's an important thing for these elder divinities to have, is this sense of just doing things. It doesn't have to make consistent sense. It's just like a series of impulses. And so you can have conflicts between these elder gods, and you can have cooperations and actions that don't make sense but have results that are good or bad, and there doesn't seem to be a motive behind them. They do them and things happen. And that's sort of what I want those elder gods to feel like. But one of the things I built into my mythos of how this all assembles into the universe is, from that very beginning, when you have seething chaos where anything can happen at any time, just pure random chance suggests that at some point you're going to get order and logical cause and effect as just a random chance event that happens somewhere in that universe. And I sort of view that as, in this world in this universe built around chaos and disorder, a bubble of a single cell of order would be like cancer. And one bubble of order can split and grow and split and grow like a tumor in the sea of chaos that is. And within this tumor starts to grow a realm of order and purpose and motive. And so within that framework, you have the very first inklings of beings that would eventually become gods in their own right, divinities. So these beings, having emerged from and growing and consuming within the seething sea of chaos and to a certain degree magic, would in probability learn to use the chaos and magic as fuel for growing and building themselves. And so if you have these beings that feed off of the chaos and produce order, that establishes both realms in which order can grow and the ability to reproduce and spread and grow and manipulate chaos and magic to achieve things that would necessarily be reasoned or orderly. And so from chaos, you've got the first beings that learn how to manipulate the magic and the chaos and use those forces to grow in power, become nigh immortal, and become the very first tyrant gods, the Titans, if you will. And at some point, there's going to be a fight between chaos and the tyrant gods, and within the tyrant gods may be another generation, their children or whatever, that overthrow them and assert a sort of order after the destruction of the chaotic beings. And so within that, oh great, now I got an ear infection. Within this overall realm of chaos, these bubble islands of order might be built on the remains of slain. This is the part where I start to get a little back and forth about it. Like, would those first tyrant kings be as if they emerged as simple human beings that climbed to power? And I'm feeling like potentially you don't have to have the tyrant kings slain in that regard. You could literally have the first beings come into existence and they are mortal like we all are. And only a few of them ascend to immortality and power of a divine proportion. All the ones that die may set down the foundation for these. They become this, like the seashell fossils and the fossilized coral. These first beings may become that on which the realms of heavens are built. So we go from nothing exists to chaos comes into existence in response to things that haven't happened yet. And from there, you have the random chance of order emerging within chaos, spreading like a cancer, and spawning the first beings to ascend to tyrant kings. And then in that struggle of tyrant king versus tyrant king, the Norse gods versus the Vanir, and the peace that has to be resolved at a certain point within that process, you have the sort of emergence of the current divinity pantheon. Now, who gets to ascend to those levels? Did it stop with the first tyrant kings? Not in my view. So I have to make my universe and my world building allow for the possibility of more gods to emerge over time. Partly because what I want the characters, the players to do is have their characters go through struggles, accumulate more power, and those that can make it through ascend to godhood again. Because they'll start as gods, fall, become mortal beings, and have to ascend to godhood again. So if we do this, there has to be a pathway for a mortal being to become a god. And if I'm going to build a structure of a story around that premise, I have to figure out what the relationship between a divinity and all the other life forms are. And I feel like the way I've currently structured it in my mythology of this setting is to have, in that dawn of moments, those animalistic, chaotic beings also spawn the animalistic, chaotic animals of the world. And that the rise of humanity and thinking beings like us is down to order coming into existence. And from that point of view, learning to harvest the chaos and manipulate the magic of the chaos. Humans, some of them ascended to an immortal form. Those that didn't may exist as spirits, ghosts and what have you. But sort of inherent in the structure of what I'm working on thus far is the idea of not just the being that goes from mortal to divine, but also having other beings. Like, we exist as a series of our own cells, but within us exist beneficial bacteria that enable us to live, and without them, our life would be suffering and short. So I have this sort of idea of the structure of divinity within this story universe has a focus on becoming multicellular. So we moved from a point where life on Earth was single-celled organisms moving around, and those single-celled organisms took different paths from that point on. Some stayed single-celled organisms, and a lot of them became like the bacteria that benefit us, the microbiome that we have in our body. Others teamed up with each other to become multicellular organisms. So 5 cells to billions of cells. And I wanted to build the idea of divinity as having been developed out of a multi-spirit. So it's sort of like it's like a multicellular organism, but instead of using cells, you use multiple spirits stacking together to become a divine spirit. They work in concert and cooperation. And certain cells, spirits, could be removed from that organism and it doesn't overly hurt it. And some can reproduce and grow, and the power and the size of that organism can grow. So I kind of wanted to build divinity on that mindset. So you start as a single human entity, a single conscious organism on Earth, one of us. And then through a method of growing in power and influence, being able to combine with other or even multiply yourself to a degree that you're able to grow past the limits of a single person entity is like part of the first step of growing. And so if there's multiple people who are the source of the divine spirit, that gives the possibility of decentralizing, like a hive mind almost, a decentralized divinity within that group. But in addition to that, having the ability to symbiotically relate to a microbiome on the macro scale. So I wanted there to be humans or demi-humans or fae or dwarves or whatever who are the sort of the beneficial bacteria. They assist and help grow and increase the health and strength of the organism that they participate in. But they also have the ability to switch to other organisms. And so for me, in my mind, what I'm thinking of is human beings in that regard who are another type of human. And it could be anyone. Anyone could be any one of those. But when you look at mythological structures of divinities, they're almost always accompanied by other celestial entities. And in this case, we're talking about angels and demons. And so, yes, have the possibility for people to be humans that could rise to divine status, have humans that could rise to angelic status, and maybe have a pathway by which the angelic beings can ascend to godhood as well. So you have these 3 types of beings: the rose to divinity on their own terms by learning to tap magic and chaos. And then you have the possibility of stealing some of that divinity from one of them to augment yourself to a level of divinity, or a human and an angel forming a symbiotic connection that allows them to exceed the confines of a single body. And once you become a multi-body cooperative, you become the first steps in a hive mind. And that hive mind is what you need to get to the level of becoming a divinity in your own right. And so with that in mind, I think that's the structure I'm going with for how divinities come into being. And it's important to the story because you start as one of these multicellular organisms and you live in a realm with other multicellular organisms surrounded by angelic hive. And it's possible, it's important to discuss that the story is also going to have an element of divinity versus the chaotic elder gods. And so if you're going to have that, what happens when an angelic entity goes Ronin? You know, it loses its master or somehow is broken free and has the option to choose to become a part of another hive. Because remember, as the microbiota of a multicellular organism, they can switch hosts at any given time. And if at some point they're in the midst of switching hosts and somehow break free, they get to choose who their next host is. And I want it to be an option that they have the option to choose to become connected with chaos. So in that case, they switch from being an angelic symbiont to a demonic symbiont. And so you have these island realms floating in chaos that are the multiple heavens in which reside multiple pantheons of multicellular organisms with their angelic symbionts. But outside of that is a wider realm of seething chaos where elder gods may still wander as giant behemoths of nightmare and chaos. And you might get some of those symbionts that join with that and become demonic symbionts. And so that gives space for, in the realms of stories that we tell, different worlds, whatever, where do angels and demons and gods all come from? Are the elder gods the titans and the pantheons that they pray to? Where do they all come from? Where do they all go? Where do they come from, Cotton Eye Joe? Sorry, I had to do that. I had to finish that way. But so that structure of the divinities and whatnot exists. I feel like it's important to also sort of set up a scenario in which the doorways between the divine realm and the earthly realms are sort of closed, but there's sort of a peephole, a cat door, maybe, I don't know, a pet door, that kind of goes one way or the other, in which you have sort of like lost civilizations, Atlantis or things like that, Shangri-La, which serve as openings from which one can pass from one realm into another. Ideally, they would be built as doorways for divinities to act in the world, and thus they would lead to those islands, those floating islands of order in the Sea of Chaos. But when a city like Atlantis is destroyed by some godly conflict on it, and it sinks, that doorway to an island of order may now be a doorway into a sea of chaos. And so that may become a portal through which demons can move. And so that sort of mindset of structuring it so that you can have passage between realms. Now, I'm still struggling with one thing, and that is the nature of the human spirit of beings that don't ascend to divinity. What happens to them when they die? So having characters die without ascending to divinity is going to be something that happens no matter what story I write or universe or game I build. So how do I, explain that? How do I run that through? What happens to those spirits? Now, an angelic being may also have the same consequence. So you've got humans, angels, and divinities. What happens to a divinity when it's slain? What does that look like? How does that work? And the way I've been building my universe here so far suggests that when a divinity is slain, it's shattered into its constituent minds. So angels may be freed from the hive mind, as well as the individual beings on their separate worlds suddenly find themselves no longer part of a hive being. And I want those people to have lived lives with a sort of unconscious connection to that divinity hive mind without necessarily always being conscious of it. But now that they're no longer connected to it, I guess it's not necessarily a hive mind, it's a hive spirit. But now that they're not connected to it, they're separate mortal entities. They're like the human beings we started with, but they contain a seed of their former divinity. I think of them more like taking a cutting from a plant and trying to grow it again. So it's sort of like cloning a tree. You take a piece from a branch and a piece from a root, and you splice them together and you put them in soil and take care of them, and you can sometimes cause them to grow into a new tree. That's sort of the approach I want to take with those slivers of divinity that are broken off, is give them the option to grow into another copy of the divinity. So having that potential, I think, is important. Having the symbionts able to reclaim their angelic heritage is a similar process. But then, are they differentiated from baseline humans that don't have that seed? Because another aspect of this that's important to me is doing a little bit of like the Highlander bit, where you have these vestiges of gods, and they can reclaim their divinity by hunting down other beings of divine nature and killing the vestiges of them and drawing out the divine spark to fuel their own climb to divinity. So it's possible to take a divine entity, shatter it into its vestiges, and then hunt down its vestiges and eliminate them, so that you're absorbing their essence into yourself, and it fuels your climb to divinity, but it dissipates and spreads out what's left of the divinity that was shattered. So I feel like that should be pretty much the only way to slay a divinity. I think in the old days, before the current storyline that I'm building, before that happened, when gods warred with gods, I would say the way that probably happened was the hive mind of one god slew all the parts of the hive mind of the other god and left them a shadow, a vague memory of a thing that once was there. I think that makes some sense. And the angels, to a certain degree, would be able to ascend to divinity by accumulating those divinity sparks from other divine beings. And a human could theoretically do the same thing, although I feel like for a baseline human that has never been a divinity, it's important for them to not be overtaken by a divine spark. So you don't want it to be possible for, say, okay, so let's say you start with a divinity, a divine being, you shatter it into its parts, or maybe you don't shatter it, but you manage to kill off all but one of its human bodies, therefore anchoring it down into one being left with the touch of that divine spark for that being. If you kill that one being, that spark is there. If another divine being absorbs that spark, they add it to their own mass, and that being becomes diffuse, no longer able to reassemble itself. A angelic being or a demonic being could absorb that and use it to help itself climb to a level of divinity. But a human who absorbed it would become a host, like a replacement body, like a vessel for that divinity to take root again. So if being Alpha was slain and their last vestige of divine spark was absorbed by an angel, that angel could use it to step themselves up to potentially ascend to godhood, because the angel can collaborate with other angels or humans to form its own vestiges. But a human doesn't have any other option other than to form a symbiosis with one of the angelic or demonic beings. And then from there, once they've have that duality or minor hive spirit, they can take in a divine spark, and that can be what helps them ascend to their own level of divinity. I think that makes a certain amount of sense. So that's discussing how gods may die. Angelic beings, I feel like for them, I almost want to do something a little bit more along the lines of, like, I got to figure out where they originate from. Is it just that first set of cells that differentiated? Some stayed symbiotic individual cells and some went multicellular? Oh, I don't know. Like, because I feel like part of what we need to think about with the angelic beings is when one dies, they don't necessarily have their own divine spark. But I want them to have the opportunity to not have death be the end for them. I feel like having them be able to, like the human being that is the symbiont being, the angelic being, maybe be mortal human being, dies and ascends to angel position or demon position. And then if those states of being are compromised, they may descend back into mortal humanity. So it may just be like a reincarnation cycle for them. And the only way that they can ascend to divinity is to absorb a divine spark or belong to an entity with a divine spark. I really feel like, yeah, that might be the way to go for them. If they die, just have them reincarnate. Is there a way to break that reincarnation cycle? Like with the gods, if you disperse them enough and absorb them into other entities, I feel like the only way to really break the reincarnation cycle may be to ascend to a divinity. And once you've ascended there, you're beholden to the rules of divinity, where if you are separated into your constituent components and the last of them are absorbed by somebody else, then you are essentially lost. But that brings the third group, the baseline human, the neither angelic nor the divine, the ones that we first started. Now they have to have the possibility, the potential that the very first to ascend to divinity had. They have to be able to take that same path. So tap into and harness the magic and the chaos of the primordial realms to grant themselves immortality and grant themselves subject minds and spirits that they can then use to build their multicellular nature. That has to be one possible path for them. So ascent to divinity through the traditional path. They also have, and I feel like part of the story should be making that, like the ones that get to that level of divinity, potentially closing doors to make it harder for others to come up behind them. But I also feel like there should be the route of forming a symbiotic pairing with an angelic being or a demonic being and absorbing a divine spark into that symbiotic pairing. At that point, you become a multicellular organism with a divine spark in it. And then, failing that, what happens to a human being that does not ascend to divinity? Can they ascend to an angelic state? I don't know that one yet. But I also feel like the other half of that is, if they can ascend to an angelic state, that has to be a trial. You achieve it, you're not guaranteed it. And then from that point of view, what happens to the ones that neither really reach a divinity state or an angelic state? What happens to them? Do they just become restless spirits that wander the realms? Maybe. I got to figure out what that looks like. And so those are like the two chunks of hurdles that I'm playing with right now in defining some of the rigid rules of how this all fits together. What makes a divinity, what makes an angel, and what makes a human, and what happens to them when you unmake them. Those are very important questions as far as I'm concerned with this. And then from there, some of that is going to influence the factors that we use to delineate our magic system, which I will talk about at another point. How many minds per world do you need for your hive mind? I would say if you have a partnership of 2 minimum and the ability to tap the magic and chaos that form a divine spark, I think 2 beings is all you need minimum. Okay, so I would almost place that almost implies a hierarchy of divinities. So you have the multicellular being that is a divinity with angelic symbiotes and vestiges throughout the universe, the cosmos. And that is like a massive hive. And that, I think, lends itself to powerful beings. you might get something to the effect of a divinity that is maybe doesn't have an angelic host, but has a few vestiges. And you also have to take into account a divinity that has angelic host, but no vestiges. And then you have to potentially take into consideration entities that have neither angelic host nor vestiges on any of the worlds, but sheer ability to tap and control the magic and the chaos, have managed to grant themselves some form of immortality. So I should probably make note of that and really kind of contemplate that over the next 24 hours to see if I can break some of those uncertainties down. So I think that's what I'm going to do. We're 45 minutes in. It's pretty much midnight here. I'm going to call it here, and I will catch you tomorrow, and we'll do a little more contemplating on the structure of immortality within my mythical realm. Okay, that sounds like a boatload of things here, and I want the system to be robust enough that when it comes time for translating it over to playable games, it's not just for fiction, but playable games, that the rule system works consistently, but also to a degree where if I can digitize the games, make a computer game. Because one of the things I think about when I think about Dungeons and Dragons tabletop games is TSR and Strategic Simulations Incorporated partnership to produce the Forgotten Realms video game included most of the rules of how to play Dungeons and Dragons on a computer. And if I'm going to build a game, a tabletop role-playing game based off of the story setting that I'm writing and planning out here, then I need to see if there's a way. I don't want to build one that breaks the ability to translate it over to that gaming mechanism. So I gotta, think about, is there a way to translate that aspect? When I'm doing my multiple different tiers, like I do my divinity realm and each of my different worlds, one of them is a superhero realm, and I have to be able to say, is this somebody who develops a superpower from being have a magic alchemical mixture spilled on them? They go blind, but they gain the ability to sense their environment with a sonar. Do I include the ability to invent new things through super genius? Do I include the ability to find magical devices that grant you certain abilities? Do I grant you that in an entire realm of human beings, you're the only elf, and you were sent there from your dying realm by your parents to live among humanity like Superman? If I do those things, I have to have some sort of mechanism that decides which of those courses are available to you. And in the Medusa realm, I want to have a mechanism for deciding whether or not you have the petrifying gaze. And so there's got to be that kind of chance to decide whether or not that happens. And then another setting, the zombie apocalypse, is there somebody who potentially has immunity to the infection? I don't think that's the way I'm going with the story, but as an example, can you roll to see if you are one of them? And so if I'm going to do that, building a mechanism that works for those three things may also be the mechanism that decides in the divine realm whether or not you're born divine, angelic, and an ascendant human, or what. Like is there a role to decide that as well? And can that same role be a mechanism that works in all 4 of those settings? And then from there, figure out if there's a mechanism by which I can apply that to making a digital game, like a video game, including not just the standard role-playing aspects of the game, but also the ability to make that factor into the type of character you can play. All right, so that's it for this time, for real. We are at a little after midnight. I have to still go eat something, and then I'm off to bed. So I will catch you tomorrow. There we go, and I will call it there, and we will see how we did.